I never imagined that the greatest light of my life would come from the very people I'd given my heart to most. My own son had secretly planned a trip without me, and his wife, with that venomous smile, pretended nothing was happening. What they didn't know is that I was never the fragile, forgotten woman they painted me as. Behind my wrinkles and my silence lies a truth capable of turning the tables. I am the largest shareholder in the airline that supports their every luxury. And within the family that tried to silence me, I wield a power no one imagined. But don't expect a simple tale of revenge. This is a story of humiliation, silence, revolt, and, above all, overcoming. Because sometimes, it's in the depths of contempt that we discover the strength to rise again. I never thought the silence of a half-open door could hurt me so much. It was by chance that I overheard, in the hallway, my daughter-in-law's voice whispering excitedly about their upcoming trip. Packages, reservations, detailed plans, and no room for me. My heart froze right there, between the living room and the kitchen. I, who had so often been the foundation of this family, now saw myself as a burden to be hidden. I stood still, clutching the towel in my hands, as if that piece of cloth could anchor me to the ground. Her laughter cut through the air like a blade, and my son's voice responded softly, complicitly, as if it were natural to exclude one's own mother. I swallowed hard. I didn't cry there. I've learned over the years that tears don't solve anything when contempt has already set in. But it hurt. Oh, how it hurt. At that moment, an avalanche of memories washed over me. I remembered every night I tossed and turned in bed to listen for my son's breathing. I remembered the cold I endured sewing clothes in the early hours of the morning to pay for school. I remembered the ration food, so he always had a full plate. All of that seemed to have evaporated in the face of a simple choice, leaving myself out. I walked slowly to my room, pretending I hadn't heard anything. I closed the door carefully, as if hiding were less humiliating than facing it. The silence in the room weighed more heavily than the screams. It was as if the walls were hugging me, trying to stifle the tears that insisted on escaping. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my wrinkled hands, and asked myself, at what point did I stop being needed? The worst part wasn't the trip itself. The worst part was the way it was done. Hidden, planned like a shameful secret. It was as if I were an inconvenient shadow that would ruin the family photos. And, inside me, the wound opened even wider because it wasn't the first time they'd belittled me. It was just the first time I realized so clearly that they no longer saw me as part of the future. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I looked at that woman with white hair, deep wrinkles, and tired eyes. I saw there not just her age, but the entire story of someone who supported a home alone, without a father for her son, without a partner to share the burden. The reflection stared back at me silently, and I almost asked, is it my fault? But deep down I knew his absence wasn't my choice. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every laugh I'd heard echoed like a hammer in my head. They planned fun, rest, smiles, while I carried the burden of rejection alone. The injustice burned inside me, but I knew I couldn't let it get me down. Because, even though I was scorned, there was something that kept me going. The love of my grandchildren, who ran into my arms every time they came home. I remembered the little ones, the joy in their eyes when they saw me. This thought gave me strength. If the son I raised had chosen to deny me, my grandchildren reminded me every day that my presence still mattered. They saw me, they loved me, and it was for them that I took a deep breath and choked back my tears. I didn't want them to grow up watching this silent war. But a flame began to ignite within me. It wasn't hatred, nor a desire for revenge. It was something deeper, the certainty that they hadn't yet discovered who I truly was. They saw me as a disposable old woman, but they didn't know the woman who had carte blanche in heaven. The silent mother was also the majority shareholder of the company they would use for travel. I smiled to myself, a bitter smile. The secret trip would be just the first chapter of a much larger story. They thought I was weak, but they didn't yet know what I was capable of. And that early morning, alone in my room, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer be an extra in my own life. The next morning, I summoned the courage to broach the subject. I waited for my son to leave his room and called him into the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee still wafted through. I sat down across from him calmly, hiding the lump in my throat. I asked, almost in a whisper, "Are you guys going on a trip?" He shifted uncomfortably, lowered his eyes, and took a sip of coffee before answering. "Yeah, we will, Mom. But it's nothing big. Just a quick thing, to rest," he said, avoiding my eyes. My heart raced. I asked then, with all the dignity I could muster, "What about me? Can I come along?" The question seemed simple, but it carried all the hope of being seen. His answer, however, landed like a blow. "Oh, Mom, this time it's not possible. It's going to be a bit rushed, you know? You wouldn't feel comfortable," he replied, choosing his words like someone trying to hide the blade of a knife. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. It wasn't just a no way, it was a we don't want you there. The daughter-in-law, who until then had just been watching, crossed her arms and gave a smirk. "It's going to be a couple's trip, you know how it is, right? Children, commitments, we don't want to bother you." Bother. That word kept hammering in my mind. So I was a nuisance. I, who had given my life for that boy, was now just a hindrance in the plans of the new family he had built. I took a deep breath, but didn't cry. I didn't give them the pleasure of watching me break down. I just said, "I understand." And I returned my gaze to my coffee cup. The bitter taste seemed to match the burning sensation inside me. My son tried to look relieved, but I saw a shadow of guilt cross his face. It was brief, but I recognized it. After all, a mother sees even what her child tries to hide. As they discussed the details of the trip, I fell silent. I heard each word as if hammers were hammering into my place outside the circle. It was strange, but in that silence, I found strength. Because I realized it wasn't me who was losing something. It was them who were moving away from the root, the foundation that had sustained them thus far. I got up slowly, washed my cup, and returned to my room. The sound of her laughter echoed through the house like a triumph. Each laugh was another brick in the wall separating me from my son. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes, trying to push away the pain, but the tears flowed on their own. It was impossible to hold them back this time. In that silent cry, I realized that the denied invitation wasn't about any ordinary trip. It was about a place that no longer existed for me in my son's life. It was about his heart, which, influenced by his father's absence and his wife's manipulations, had pushed me out. But I also understood something important. Every refusal carries a hidden choice. And if they chose to exclude me, I would choose to stand up. They could deny me my place on the journey, but they wouldn't deny me my right to exist, to tell my story, to show who I am. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "It's not over. It's not over yet." And in that moment, amidst tears and anger, a courage I hadn't yet known I possessed was born within me. On Sunday, we all went to my daughter-in-law's mother-in-law's house. The table was laden. The guests were smiling, and my son wore a smile so wide it seemed rehearsed. I watched them silently, like someone watching a play. Their every gesture was calculated, their every word measured to maintain their image as the perfect couple. Deep down, however, I knew their perfection was nothing more than a veneer. As she served dessert, she raved about the family togetherness and how happy they were. Applause and praise came from all sides, and I, sitting in a corner, felt invisible. Funny how the same son who, at home, had refused me a simple invitation, here seemed to be the exemplary husband, the ideal son-in-law. It was as if my presence were merely an extra to lend credibility to the performance. I looked around and saw admiring glances directed at them. With every word his daughter-in-law spoke, my son nodded proudly, as if she were the official voice of the house. No one there could imagine what happened when the doors closed. No one knew I was already being treated like an intruder in the very family I'd helped build. The mask shone so brightly it blinded everyone else. I wondered, did he believe this fantasy too? Was his smile one of conviction, or just another gesture to please the audience? Deep down, I wanted to believe he was just a confused man, lost between his mother's love and his wife's influence. But it increasingly seemed to me that he chose to believe the mask because it was easier than facing the truth. During the toast, I heard my daughter-in-law thank the wonderful family that always supports us. I almost choked. Support? I, who had always been accused of getting in the way, of being dead weight, was now the backdrop for the happy speech. It was cruel irony. I smiled slightly, a bitter smile that no one noticed, but that I screamed inside. The children ran around the yard, oblivious to the adults' vanity. They were the only truth in that performance. Their embrace was pure, unmasked. When they came running to call me Grandma, I felt my heart warm. It was as if their love was my last refuge, the only place where sincerity still existed. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law insisted on talking about the trip. She showed off details of the itinerary, hotels, and tours. She spoke as if rubbing salt in a wound, without the slightest shame. I remained silent, pretending not to care, but each word pierced me like a dagger. The worst part was seeing my son laughing, thrilled with the plans, as if he'd forgotten I was there, listening to everything. At that table, I realized how much appearances mattered more than bonds. They were willing to maintain a mask of perfection in front of others, even if it cost the hearts of those who truly loved them. It was then that I understood. The war wasn't just at home. It was also in the eyes of others, who bought the lie without asking questions. But what they didn't know was that I held a greater truth. A truth that couldn't be masked, that couldn't be hidden behind rehearsed smiles. I wasn't the disposable old woman they portrayed. I was the owner of a silent power, the kind of power that doesn't need to be announced to exist. And that afternoon, amidst false laughter and sweet words, I made a silent promise. If they were so busy maintaining the pretense of the perfect family, I would show them, when the time was right, that their perfection wouldn't withstand the first crack of truth. It was my birthday. I woke up early as always, made coffee, and tried to convince myself it would be a different day. Deep down, I knew there wouldn't be a party, but I harbored that foolish hope of at least receiving a sincere gesture. When they arrived, my son was carrying a plastic bag. He smiled awkwardly, while his daughter-in-law watched, satisfied, as if she knew what was coming. He handed me the package hurriedly, as if following protocol. I, still hopeful, opened it slowly, savoring the moment. But when I saw the contents, my chest tightened. A pair of cheap plastic flip-flops, the kind you find on any street corner. Silence fell over the room. His daughter-in-law let out a small, hidden chuckle, and my son pretended not to notice the discomfort. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. The gift wasn't just simple, it was a message. A clear message that, to them, I was worth nothing more than that. It was the material expression of the contempt I already felt in my daughter-in-law's eyes. I took a deep breath, swallowed the lump in my throat, and forced a smile. I thanked her as if I'd been given a jewel, because I'd learned my whole life to hide wounds behind dignity. But inside, the pain throbbed. It wasn't about money. Never had been. I didn't need expensive gifts. I just wanted to be remembered with affection and respect. I'd received flowers picked from the garden, hand-scribbled letters, drawings for my grandchildren, all lovingly kept. But that pair of slippers, cold and devoid of affection, carried the weight of humiliation. I remembered the early mornings I stayed up sewing, the cold I braved without a coat, so my son would always have the best. I remembered when he fell ill as a child and, penniless, I begged for help at the pharmacy. Every sacrifice came flooding back, as if my memory wanted to remind me of the contrast between what I had given and what I was now receiving. I looked at him, waiting for a gesture, a word that would ease the pain. But nothing came. His silence was crueler than the gift itself. His daughter-in-law then stepped forward and commented sarcastically, "Oh, it's practical, right? You can use it indoors, very comfortable." I felt my face heat up. It was as if she had planned the whole thing to embarrass me. The grandchildren, innocent, ran up to me and hugged my legs. "Grandma, happy birthday," they said with genuine joy. It was that hug that saved me from collapsing in front of them. I stroked their hair and smiled, hiding the open wound in my chest. Because, deep down, I didn't want them to witness the poison that was already poisoning the adults in the family. At that moment, I realized that life was testing me. I was faced with a choice: wallow in grief or use that humiliation as fuel to rise even stronger. And, even with my heart broken, I knew I had to choose the latter. Because a pair of flip-flops wouldn't define my worth. Still, I kept the gift. Not out of attachment, but as a reminder of the day I understood, once and for all, who was truly by my side. I kept it so I would never forget how underestimated I was and how much strength I still had stored within me. And that night, before I went to sleep, I placed my slippers at the foot of my bed. I looked at them and whispered, "You don't know who I am. You'll learn." A few days later, we were gathered for Sunday lunch. The table was set, laden with plates and silverware gleaming in the living room light. The grandchildren laughed, oblivious to the tension, and I tried to maintain a calm expression. It was then that my daughter-in-law, with the coolness of someone throwing a stone into a pond, placed a sheaf of papers on the table. Her eyes shone, not with tenderness, but with triumph. "We need your signature, ma'am," she said, pushing the documents toward me. Her tone was firm, almost authoritative, like someone giving orders to a maid. My heart raced. It wasn't the first time she'd appeared with papers for me to sign, but there was something different in the air. My son remained silent, staring at his plate like a frightened child. I grabbed my glasses, opened the papers, and began reading. My stomach churned. Amidst the legalese and complicated terms, I realized they were transferring part of my assets into his name. My home, the same house where I raised my son, where I'd experienced the pains and joys of a lifetime, was listed there as simply property to be regularized. I looked up and stared at my son. He looked away, unable to bear the weight of my silent question. It was my daughter-in-law who stepped forward. "It's just bureaucracy, Mom. It'll make everyone's lives easier. You don't need to worry." I smiled bitterly. When someone says you don't need to worry, that's exactly when we most need to open our eyes. I took a deep breath, trying not to tremble. I placed the papers back on the table and said firmly, "Signing without understanding has never been part of my life. I learned the hard way that the devil hides in the details." The silence that followed was deafening. My daughter-in-law pursed her lips, irritated by my resistance. My son sighed deeply, as if carrying a weight he didn't want to face. The grandchildren, confused, asked if they could play in the yard. I gave them a sweet smile, freeing them from that heavy scene. It was for their sake that I needed to remain calm. I couldn't allow them to witness the mess that was spreading across that table. So, in a calm voice, I asked the adults to be clear. "Tell me exactly what you're trying to do." The daughter-in-law laughed dryly. "Come on, ma'am, don't complicate things. It's just paper. The world doesn't move like it did in your time. We need agility." That sentence hurt me more than the words printed on the documents. It was an attempt to reduce me to a disposable past, as if I were an old piece of furniture, worthless in the present. But something inside me clicked. I wasn't just an old piece of junk. I was the root that held that tree together. And if they thought they could fool me with sheets of paper and pretty words, they were about to discover I had far more powerful weapons that didn't need to be advertised to exist. I looked at the documents again, calmly folded them, and handed them back to my daughter-in-law. "I'll think about it," I said simply, with the firmness of someone who knows better than to reveal all her cards at once. And in that moment, I saw the flash of anger in her eyes. She wanted my silence and submission. But what she would get was resistance and, in due time, revelation. I rose from the table with what dignity I had left and walked to my room. Behind me, I heard murmurs of disappointment, but I didn't care, because I knew this wouldn't be the last battle, just the first step in a war they weren't prepared to face. That night, the house seemed larger than it actually was. Silence filled every corner, as if the walls were watching me, waiting for my reaction. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper still fresh in my memory, and felt the weight of loneliness settle on my shoulders. The silence, which had so often been my refuge, now became my enemy. I closed my eyes and remembered every sacrifice in my life. The times I kept quiet to avoid arguments. The times I held back tears to protect my son from pain. And now, that same silence seemed to be taking its toll on me. Was it worth keeping quiet so many times? I thought to myself, because what suffocated me today wasn't their noise, but the echo of everything I'd left unsaid. Outside, I heard laughter coming from the living room. They spoke softly, but I still managed to capture the tone of victory. My daughter-in-law, especially, seemed to savor every detail of my hesitation in signing the papers. It was as if the silence made me an accomplice to the injustice itself, and that hurt more than any cruel words could. I stood up and walked to the mirror. The reflection showed a tired, red-eyed, but still firm woman. "They don't know who you are," I said quietly, staring at myself. And it was true. They saw only the weary mother, the loving grandmother, the woman they deemed fragile. They didn't know the strength that sustained me, the story that shaped me. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scene at the table, the papers, my daughter-in-law's disdainful look. The silence in the room mingled with the noise in my mind. I thought about screaming, about confronting her, about exposing the whole truth right then and there. But I realized it wasn't the time yet. Silence could be cruel, but it could also be strategic. At dawn, the heaviness remained. I went to make coffee, as usual, and found my son in the kitchen. He tried to look at me, but I looked away. We remained silent for a few minutes, each trapped in our own fantasies. I wanted to ask him if he remembered who raised him, who sustained him when no one else believed in him. But I remained silent, knowing that any words would fall on dry ground. Sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 speeches. At that moment, he was screaming inside me. He was telling me that the distance between us wasn't made of miles, but of unacknowledged memories. He, sitting at the table, drank coffee as if nothing had happened. And I, on the other side, swallowed tears along with my bread, feigning a normalcy that no longer existed. I looked at my grandchildren, who came running into the kitchen, smiling, asking for bread and butter. They were the only reason I didn't explode. I didn't want them to grow up seeing their grandmother at war with their father. So I smiled, poured the coffee, and pretended not to. The silence was clothed in care again, even though it tore me apart inside. That day, I understood that silence can be both a prison and a weapon. A prison when it prevents us from expressing our feelings. A weapon when we choose it to guard the right moment to act. I needed to learn to transform that heavy silence into strength. I needed to let it mature within me until I could use it as a shield and, if necessary, as a sword. And so it was, between bitter coffees and swallowed words, that I decided I would not be the woman they portrayed. I would not be reduced to the silence of a victim. I would become the silence of someone who observes, who waits, who knows that the moment of truth always arrives. Sooner or later, it does. That night, there was a family gathering. The table was set with crystal glasses, bottles of expensive wine, and plates that looked like works of art. Everyone laughed, spoke loudly, and toasted the union they so extolled. I, sitting in the corner, watched. From the outside, it looked like a party. From the inside, It was a courtroom. Every smile was a sentence, every toast a silent accusation against me. My son raised his glass and, in a firm voice, announced, "To the perfect family we've built together." The words echoed through the room, but they sounded hollow to me. A perfect family? How could a family be perfect if it excluded its own mother? I tapped my glass lightly on the table, weakly, and simply smiled. My silence was more eloquent than any speech. As they toasted, I remembered the times I'd worked twice as hard to ensure my son lacked for nothing. The taste of wine in my mouth mingled with the bitter taste of the tears I'd fought to hold back. I would toast too, but not to their lie. I toasted my own resilience, the courage to be there, whole, even though I was treated like trash. The daughter-in-law, with that look of someone who thinks she's won, approached me and clinked her glass to mine. "To your health," she said in a tone that sounded almost mocking. I swallowed hard. I didn't respond. Sometimes, the biggest blow isn't retaliating, it's letting the other person drown in their own poison. My son laughed loudly, as if trying to hide something. I knew him well. That laugh wasn't joy, it was nervousness. Deep down, he knew the show had cracks. That, behind the act, there was an uncomfortable truth waiting to emerge. But he preferred to maintain the charade, because truth requires courage, and courage was what he lacked at that moment. The children ran between the chairs, genuinely laughing, bringing life to the stifling atmosphere. Each laugh was a breath of fresh air amidst that toxic cloud. When they hugged me, I momentarily forgot the bitterness that surrounded me. It was in them that I found the strength not to get up from the table and leave once and for all. At the final toast, everyone stood and raised their glasses. I stood too. But instead of repeating their empty words, I murmured quietly, just to myself, "To the truth that is yet to be told." I took a steady sip, without trembling, and felt the wine burn down, as if confirming my silent promise. Eyes turned to me, trying to decipher my expression. Some thought I was emotional, others that I was just old and tired. No one noticed that, in that moment, I was more awake than ever. It wasn't fragility, it was preparation. I knew that bitter toast was the beginning of a turning point. After supper, I collected my glass and left it on the sink. I looked at the reflection in the glass and saw a woman scarred, but not defeated. A woman who had learned to transform pain into ammunition. I smiled slightly, a smile no one noticed. The game was just beginning, and I would no longer be a supporting actor. That night, I lay down with the feeling that something had changed. Their toast was a farce, mine the truth. And the truth, sooner or later, always finds its way. At breakfast the next day, the table seemed peaceful, but the atmosphere was charged with something only I could sense. As I buttered my bread, I heard my daughter-in-law comment, almost whispering, but loud enough to hurt. "In the end, everything we spend on her is never recognized." I swallowed hard. I didn't respond, but deep inside, I felt as if each word were an invisible charge, a receipt for a debt I never incurred. My son remained silent, and his silence hurt even more. Because when someone remains silent in the face of injustice, silence becomes complicity. He didn't defend me, didn't say a single word to dispel the accusation. He simply lowered his head, as if afraid to contradict her. And I, once again, became a defendant without the right to defend myself. I looked at my hands, scarred by time. Each wrinkle was a reminder of the work I'd done to ensure he never lacked for anything. But at the table, what mattered wasn't my sacrifices, but rather my daughter-in-law's poisonous narrative. She painted me as a burden, an expense, a drain on resources. And he believed it, or pretended to believe it, because it was easier than facing the truth. The coffee grew cold in my cup as I watched the theater. My daughter-in-law talked about grocery bills, the children's school fees, the trips they planned. Everything was measured, as if to remind me that I wasn't part of that future. I was the past, an annoying appendage, someone who was given the bare minimum to keep up appearances. But deep down, I knew I wasn't a burden. Quite the opposite. I was the one who had laid the foundation for everything. It was my story, my effort, my sweat that had given him the chance to get where he was. If they lived in comfort today, it was because I'd weathered the storm. And hearing insinuations that I was a waste was like spitting in the plate they always ate from. I took a deep breath and poured milk for my grandchildren. They laughed, asking for more sugar, and I smiled to hide the storm raging inside. Because I didn't want them to grow up seeing their grandmother as a burden. They needed to see in me the love, the presence, the strength I still am. So I kept quiet. But each silence became a coin deposited in an invisible account that, one day, someone would collect. My son finally opened his mouth, but not to defend me. He simply said, "Leave it alone, let's eat in peace." It was like a punch. It wasn't about peace, but about convenience. He didn't want friction. He didn't want to face his cowardice. And in that moment, I realized the invisible bill wasn't just mine. It was his too. A debt of gratitude he would have to pay sooner or later. I finished my coffee and stood up. I went to the sink and washed my cup slowly, as if washing away my sorrows. The sound of the water hitting the porcelain tile was my silent protest. I didn't need to scream to show I was hurt. My lack of words was enough to make it clear I didn't accept this debtor position. That day, I learned something important. Not all debts are paid in cash. Some are paid with respect, gratitude, and remembrance. And that was precisely what was being denied me. But I knew that time is the most relentless debt collector there is. It doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and, most importantly, it doesn't make mistakes. I left the kitchen, my head held high. They could see me as an expense, a burden, a leftover. But deep down, I carried the certainty that that invisible bill would still be presented. And when it was, there would be no excuse to save them from demanding the truth. I've always wondered if absence weighs more heavily than presence. My son's father left early, leaving a void I could never fill. I did everything I could to make him feel less missing, but deep down, I know that every silence, every empty chair at the table, became a scar. And today I realize that part of his resentment toward me stems from this hole I couldn't fill. In his mind, I was to blame. It was easier to believe I'd pushed his father away than to face the truth. He'd simply abandoned the family. I carried this fabricated guilt for years, trying to compensate with affection, gifts, and extra dedication. But no compensation is enough when the wound is called rejection. I remember the questions he asked as a child. Why doesn't my father come see me? Doesn't he love me? It hurt to answer, because every word felt like a lie. So, often, I just hugged him, hoping my silence would be more welcoming than a forced response. But that emptiness grew inside him like a ghost. Today, when I see the contempt in his eyes, I feel it's an echo of that absence. As if all the pain he felt had turned into an accusation against me. He never said it clearly, but I know that deep down, he believes I was responsible for his father's departure. And his cunning daughter-in-law took advantage of this barely healed wound to drive even greater wedges between us. Sometimes I wonder if I was wrong not to tell him the blunt truth from an early age. Perhaps if he had known who his father really was, he would have understood better. But I wanted to protect him. I wanted to prevent him from growing up hating that man. I ended up becoming an easy target for his anger. A mother always stays, and those who stay carry both the blessings and the sins. The most painful thing is realizing he doesn't see the years of sacrifice. He doesn't see the sleepless nights, the overtime, the dreams I gave up, so he could have his. To him, I'm a living reminder of his father's absence. A reminder he'd rather reject. And this rejection hurts more than any absence. As I watch him from afar, my chest tightens. I want to shout that it was never my fault, that I fought alone, that I gave it my best shot. But I know it would be no use. Words can't undo such long-standing resentments. Only time, perhaps, can undo the knots that pain has tightened inside him. My grandchildren, however, are a relief. They run to me without judgment, without demands. In their embrace, I find the love I always dreamed of receiving from my own son. They don't yet carry the weight of stories left untold. And it's for them that I stay standing, even when the burden seems unbearable. Sometimes, in the solitude of the night, I ask myself, how long will I carry this guilt that isn't mine? Will he ever understand that the real blame isn't with me, but with the one who left? Until that answer comes, I continue living with the hope that one day he'll see the truth. And until then, I've learned to live with the weight of absence. It never disappears, it just shifts within us. But it also teaches us to walk more firmly because when the ground gives way, we learn to walk on our own pain. Silence has always been my companion. When my husband left, it was in silence that I found the strength to carry on. When my son cried with longing, I rocked him without saying a word because words couldn't heal that emptiness. Now I realize that silence has become my inheritance, both the one I received and the one I left behind. And inheritances sometimes weigh more than gold or land. At work, I learned to listen more than I spoke. While men argued loudly, I remained silent, observing. They thought I didn't understand anything, but it was quite the opposite. Every pause, every swallowed word, made me see more than others saw. And that's how I grew, how I earned respect without them realizing it. This habit stayed with me at home. Faced with my daughter-in-law's rudeness, I kept quiet. Faced with my son's ingratitude, I lowered my eyes. But the silence, which had once been a shield, began to turn into a prison. It was as if each time I remained silent, I gave up a piece of myself. And little by little, they mistook silence for weakness. Today I understand that my son inherited this silence, but in a distorted form. He didn't learn to listen, he learned to hide. He doesn't talk about his feelings, he doesn't confront his pain. He prefers to swallow his hurt and turn it into silent accusations against me. It's the same silence, but instead of healing, it's become poison. Sometimes I wonder if the legacy I'm leaving my grandchildren will be the same, a heavy silence, full of things left unsaid. I don't want that for them. I want them to learn that silence can be a strength, yes, but it can also be suffocating. I want them to know how to speak when necessary, and to remain silent only when it's a choice, not an imposition. As I stared at the wine glass on the table, I remembered all the times I could have screamed. In front of the judge, when I needed to fight for my rights. In the hospital, when I wanted to ask for help but didn't. Even now, when I see my story being rewritten by those who haven't experienced anything like I have. And I realize, every silence I've made has become part of their legacy. But I don't want to be remembered only for my stillness. I want to be remembered as the woman who endured everything without breaking. As the grandmother who smiled despite the pain inside. As the mother who, even when rejected, never stopped loving. This, too, is the legacy of silence, that of someone who speaks more with gestures than with words. My son may only understand this when time takes its toll. When he realizes that the silence he imposed between us cost him more than he imagined, that the words he left unsaid can never be retrieved. This is the highest price to pay for the invisible inheritance we pass from generation to generation. That night, I wrote a letter, not to him, but to myself. I put down on paper everything I'd kept quiet for years. I cried with every line, laughed at some memories, and finally, I folded the paper and put it in a drawer. Maybe one day someone will find it. Maybe never. But just writing it, I felt some of the weight begin to lift. And then I realized, the legacy of silence doesn't have to be just pain. It can also be liberation if we have the courage to transform what we keep silent into learning. Silence has sustained me, but now it's time to use it as a bridge to truth. Because every legacy, sooner or later, needs to be shared. The table was lavishly laden, illuminated by candelabras that reflected the cold glow of crystal glasses. At first glance, it was a dinner worthy of a soap opera, but to me, it was nothing more than a stage for hypocrisy. Every bite was accompanied by sidelong glances. Every smile was rehearsed. I was there, an obligated guest, like an extra in a play starring my son and daughter-in-law. The silence between us weighed more heavily than any words. Conversations continued, superficial, as if nothing were happening. But beneath the table, resentment ran wild. like a river about to overflow. I felt like at any moment someone might say something and the entire castle of appearances would crumble. My daughter-in-law, with her poisonous sweet voice, would bring up topics like travel, shopping, and business, always hinting that I was outdated. My son laughed complicitly, unaware that each laugh was like a stab in my memory. I had raised him to be a man of character, yet there he was, laughing at his own mother to please his wife. As they talked about bills, investments, and inheritances, I chewed slowly, feeling the taste of the food mix with the bitterness of anger. None of them realized, or pretended not to realize, that if it weren't for me, that table wouldn't even exist. Everything they had began with the sweat of my hands, but today they treated me like dead weight, a nuisance to be discarded. The children, oblivious to the tension, played with their spoons, and it was in them that I found relief. Each innocent laugh broke the heavy atmosphere for a moment. I clung to these moments like someone holding onto a plank at sea. Because if it weren't for my grandchildren, I might have exploded right then and there, revealing everything I'd kept bottled up for so long. I raised my glass when they asked for a toast. To the family, my son said proudly, as if we were united. I touched the glass lightly and smiled, but inside I thought, what kind of family? A true family doesn't exclude, doesn't ridicule, doesn't push the mother against the wall. The toast echoed through the room, but within me it felt empty, hollow, false. As dessert was served, I noticed everyone avoided looking me in the eye. It was as if my presence was too uncomfortable, a vivid reminder of something they'd rather bury. And I understood. That dinner wasn't about togetherness, it was about distancing. It was a message disguised in linen napkins and fancy plates. I thought about getting up and leaving, but I didn't. I stood my ground, because sometimes the greatest challenge is enduring discomfort in silence, without giving them the pleasure of seeing me defeated. I looked each of them in the eye, slowly, and let them feel the weight of my resistance. Was my presence uncomfortable? Well, I would make a point of being even more present. That night, I understood that the dinner of our enemies was not the end, but the beginning. The start of a cold war where every gesture would carry meaning, every word a weapon. I wasn't afraid, because I had already survived much greater pain. And if they thought they could silence me forever, they were sadly mistaken. I went to my room, my soul aflame. I didn't cry, I didn't vent. I just sat on the edge of my bed and took a deep breath. The taste of that dinner was still in my mouth, but with it grew the certainty. If they wanted war, I would know how to fight. And it wouldn't be with shouting, but with the truth that, sooner or later, would come out. I returned from dinner with a heavy heart and pushed open my bedroom door. The silence inside seemed louder than any noise in the house. The walls held echoes of a time when this space was a refuge, filled with voices, laughter, and even dreams. Now, only a void remained that hurt my ears. The room seemed to ask me, where did everyone go? I ran my hand over the nightstand, covered in a fine layer of dust. Every object there held memories. The old, already yellowed photograph showed my son as a small child, smiling, unable to imagine what life would bring him. I looked at that smile and felt a pang, as if the child he once was still called to me, but the man he had become had turned his back on me. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. How many nights I cried there, hiding tears so no one would notice. How many times I prayed, asking for strength, asking for answers, asking only that my son not stray from me. But it seemed my prayers bounced off the ceiling, as if the sky had abandoned me too. The emptiness in the room wasn't just physical. It was also emotional. Every absence turned into a shadow. Every unspoken word clung to the air, making the atmosphere heavy. I wasn't alone. I was accompanied by all the painful memories. And this invisible presence was crueler than loneliness. I looked at the closet, still full of clothes I no longer wore. Clothes that held stories, scents, moments. There were pieces of me no one else saw. I thought about giving it all away, about emptying that space so I wouldn't suffer anymore. But I couldn't. It was as if stripping myself of those clothes meant stripping myself of who I was. The clock on the wall ticked away each second like hammer blows. Time seemed to mock me, reminding me that life goes on outside, while I remained trapped in that room, between past and present. The emptiness wasn't just in the space, but within me. I was, in a way, the empty room itself. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep, but the silence suffocated me. I thought about getting up, opening the window, and shouting for the world to hear my pain. But I didn't. I remained lying still, as if the weight of absence were greater than I could bear. It was like carrying an invisible burden on my chest. And yet, within all that pain, there was a spark of resilience. The room might be empty, but I wasn't defeated. There was still life pulsing within me. There was still love for my grandchildren. There were still stories to tell. There was still a truth to reveal. The emptiness was just a backdrop. It couldn't be my destiny. I sat up in bed, took a deep breath, and said softly, "I won't give up." It was barely a whisper, but it was as if the whole room heard it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like it wasn't the void speaking to me, but I was beginning to respond to the void. That night, I understood that the empty room wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new choice. I could remain a prisoner of absences, or I could transform that silence into strength. And as I closed my eyes again, I promised myself I wouldn't let the emptiness swallow me. I still had so much to live for, and the truth still needed to be told. On that gray morning, the sound of the doorbell pulled me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and so my heart raced. I walked slowly to the door, imagining it was a neighbor or some delivery. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with a face I hadn't seen in years, an old family friend, someone who knew my story better than I did. He entered with an air of urgency, carrying a worn leather briefcase that seemed to conceal heavy secrets. We sat at the kitchen table, and before I could even ask anything, he spread the documents before me. My eyes scanned the pages and froze. They were records showing attempts to erase my name from the inheritance, transferring my assets to other hands. My heart raced. The forged signatures, the legal maneuvering, it was all there. It was proof that my daughter-in-law and even my own son were behind a plan to strip me of not only my dignity, but also the memory of what I had built. I fell silent, but this time the silence wasn't acceptance. It was a contained explosion, about to rip through the air. My friend looked at me with compassion. He remembered the nights he'd seen me working when my son was still a child, and he knew that nothing we had had was easy. "They can't erase you from the story you wrote," he said firmly, as if he wanted to rekindle within me a strength I'd almost forgotten. With each line I read, a part of me broke and another grew stronger. It was like revisiting my entire life, seeing how much I struggled, how much I suffered, and now understanding that they were trying to turn it all into nothing. The weight of the contempt hurt, but the truth there, written on the paper, was my shield. I rose from the table with trembling hands. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply held that folder tightly, like someone holding a sacred weapon. I felt that, in that moment, I was no longer a victim but a protagonist. For the first time, the pain didn't immobilize me. It pushed me forward. My friend tapped me on the shoulder and said he'd stand by me, no matter what. It was like receiving an invisible hug, a relief amidst the chaos. I was no longer alone, and that presence, however small, rekindled in me the memory that there were still people who recognized my worth. I looked around the kitchen, now transformed into a scene of revelation. The house that had so often felt like a prison suddenly became a resistance barracks. The smell of coffee still in the air mingled with the energy of determination that was taking over me. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about fighting. I clutched the papers to my chest and thought about my grandchildren. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved to know that their grandmother wasn't the shadow they painted, but the root that held it all together. I wouldn't let them grow up hearing only a distorted version of the story. And so, on that ordinary morning that became a milestone, I decided I would not be silenced, I would not be erased. The unexpected visit brought not only documents, but also the courage I needed. Now, the fight had a set time, and I was ready to face whatever came. That late afternoon, With the folder of documents still stored on the nightstand, I felt a strange urge to go out. I walked the city streets as if searching for something lost in time. It was then that, as I turned the corner of an old bakery, I saw a familiar face, a colleague from the days when I worked day and night to support my son. He recognized me immediately. His gaze held the same mixture of respect and tenderness it always had. We sat at one of the tables, ordered coffee, and, between bitter sips and complicit silences, we reminisced about the days when I was just a woman trying to survive, never imagining that one day I would become the main shareholder of the company that now supported my entire family. Memories came back like waves. I remembered the hurried walks, the butterflies in my stomach from not knowing if I could make it, and the times I'd hidden tears so as not to worry my son. He looked at me with pride, saying he'd never forgotten the strength I'd conveyed, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Hearing this gave me a strange mixture of joy and pain. Joy in knowing someone saw who I truly was. Pain in realizing that my own son, the one I sacrificed everything for, chose to forget. As we talked, I felt the past coming to exact its toll on me, but also to give me a hand to move forward. My colleague, now as old as I, said he'd been following the company's trajectory from afar and knew I had a hand in every achievement. "You were never a shadow, you were always a light," he said, as if trying to restore the identity they'd tried to strip me of. I treasured those words like one who treasures a treasure. As I said goodbye, he took my hands and said, "Don't let them erase your story. You have to tell who you are before they tell you for you." It was like a sign, a voice from the past pushing me toward the future. The visit wasn't a coincidence. It was a living reminder that there were still battles to be fought. I walked back home feeling like it wasn't just me against everyone else. I carried with me every piece of history, every witness to my struggle, every scar that proved my strength. The past wasn't there to imprison me, but to give me ammunition against the present. Entering the house, I stared at the hallway mirror. I saw a scarred woman, yes, but I also saw a warrior whom time had failed to bring down. Every wrinkle, a test. Every gray hair, a trophy. The past was written in me, and no one could rewrite it without my permission. I sat in the armchair and embraced that memory like one would embrace a child. For the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel pain, I felt pride. The reunion with the past wasn't melancholy, it was fuel. I wasn't just a victim, I was a protagonist. And I was willing to show that to the world. That night, I slept with the certainty that the past and present were uniting within me. And, as I closed my eyes, I thought, if fate has given me so much silence, now is the time to transform it into a voice. Because no one can live erasing a story that was born to be remembered. The invitation arrived in a gold envelope, cold as the metal that separates those who give orders from those who obey. It was the company's annual party, that lavish ball where everyone paraded smiles and expensive clothes, pretending there were no cracks behind the glitter. I hesitated to go, but something inside me told me it was time to show I still had a voice, even if hidden behind their masks. I entered the hall, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, and everyone's gaze turned immediately. Some were in surprise, others in disguised contempt. I walked with firm steps, despite my heavy heart. I knew I wasn't just a guest, I was the silent mistress of it all. But to them, I must have seemed just a lonely, out-of-place lady. My daughter-in-law flaunted her dress as if she were the queen of the night, smiling at everyone with that air of conquest. My son, beside her, seemed like an accessory, a man who confused power with obedience. I watched them from a distance, trying to understand at what point they forgot where they came from and who had given them the foundation on which to build this empire. The dancing began. Couples twirled around the room as if they were part of a rehearsed play. Sitting in a corner, I knew I had my role to play as well. I didn't need music or rehearsed steps. My presence alone was the greatest nuisance. Because, even if they wanted to silence me, everyone there knew who truly held up those walls. One of the directors, who still respected me, approached and asked to toast with me. I raised my glass, and for a moment the room seemed to freeze. To the truth, I said, staring at my son and daughter-in-law. It was just a sip of sparkling wine, but to me it was like a scream that echoed silently, revealing that no amount of masks would be enough to hide what was to come. I felt the atmosphere grow heavy. The eyes that had previously pretended to ignore my presence now followed me, attentive. There was unease in the air, as if everyone sensed that this night wouldn't end like the others. The ball, more than a party, was a battlefield, and I was willing to play their game, but with my own cards. I walked to the balcony to breathe. The cool night air brought me momentary relief. Outside, away from the artificial lights, I could just be myself for a few minutes. I considered leaving, but my heart told me, don't run away. This is the stage where you need to stand. I took a deep breath and returned, ready to face more stares. When I returned, I noticed my son averting his gaze whenever I tried to cross paths with him. Was it fear? Guilt? Maybe both. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, stared at me with the haughtiness of someone who believes she's won. Little did she know that her mask was about to crack. The dance continued, and I stood firm. Every song, every fake laugh, every exaggerated applause was just a smokescreen to hide secrets. But I knew, no mask lasts forever. The truth, sooner or later, strips away any fantasy. I left the ballroom with my head held high. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need confrontation. My presence had already been enough to shake things up. The masquerade ball had ended for them as a night of partying, but for me it was the announcement that the game was changing. And I was ready to play until the end. When I returned home that night, silence enveloped me like a heavy blanket. I entered my room and suddenly felt like the walls were breathing. Every corner seemed to hold secrets, as if the entire house had witnessed my pain and now wanted to speak to me. It was strange, but at the same time comforting. I ran my fingers along the cracks in the wall, remembering when they were still smooth and freshly painted. There I heard my small son's cries, the laughter that filled the hallway, and also the stifled screams of nights when my father's absence tore at my soul. The walls, silent, held everything without ever judging me. I sat on the edge of the bed and closed my eyes. I swear I heard a whisper. It wasn't clear words, but a murmur that said, "Resist." As if the house itself gave me the strength not to give in. I smiled wryly. Even the walls were on my side, while my son saw me as the enemy. I walked into the living room. The old family portrait was still on the wall, but now it seemed to look at me differently. It wasn't just a memory, it was a warning. My husband's eyes, frozen in that photograph, seemed to demand a posture I'd been putting off. "Show who you are," it seemed to say. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes again. Memories came flooding back. Me, younger, lugging heavy bags while my son ran around the room, unaware of the weight I carried. The walls had watched me struggle, and perhaps that was why they now whispered courage. Suddenly, I felt I wasn't alone. It was as if the past had come to life, moving around me. Every piece of furniture, every crack, every mark on the floor was a reminder of the sacrifices that had brought me here. The house, which had so often felt like a prison, became an accomplice and a witness. I looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "I'm still here." And, oddly enough, the creak of what I heard shortly afterward sounded like an answer. Maybe it was just time. Maybe it was my imagination. But for me, it was confirmation that I wasn't giving up alone. With each step down the hallway, I felt the whispers guiding me. It wasn't fear, it was strength. I needed to understand that those walls not only guarded my silence, but also gave me back my courage. And that courage was what prepared me for what was to come. I returned to the room, took a deep breath, and rested my hand against the cold wall. "Thank you," I murmured. I wasn't thanking the concrete, but life, which even in its harshness always found a way to remind me that I wasn't defeated. That night, I slept with the feeling that the walls had cradled me, not with songs, but with memories and murmurs of resistance. And I realized my story wasn't written just in documents or inheritances. It was engraved there on every wall, in every whisper telling me to keep going. The next morning, I sat at the breakfast table like someone in the dock. My son and daughter-in-law stood before me, speaking in low voices, exchanging knowing glances, as if preparing the sentence of a silent trial. There was no judge, no jury, but I felt the weight of being judged. Their every gesture was a silent accusation. The spoon tapping the cup, the impatient sigh, the averted gaze. I knew that, in their minds, I was to blame for everything. My father's absence, the burden of past debts, even the discomfort my presence caused them now. It was as if they wanted to condemn me without the right to defend myself. I remained silent, but inside I was building my defense. I thought about every sleepless night, every hidden tear, every struggle to keep that home afloat. If there were a fair court, I would be acquitted and even applauded. But in that invisible court, presided over by pride and resentment, I was already condemned before I even spoke. My daughter-in-law spoke with a tone of false cordiality, asking if I had decided on the documents yet. The question sounded like a judge's gavel hitting the table. My son, standing next to me, didn't dare look at me. It was his silence that hurt the most because deep down I knew it wasn't just her influence, it was also the unresolved hurt of a lifetime. I looked at them both and felt my hands trembling, but I took a deep breath. If this was the tribunal they had set up, I could be a judge too. And I decided I wouldn't be condemned in silence. I haven't decided yet, but know that my story doesn't fit on fake papers or forged signatures. My voice was firm, and for a moment the makeshift courtroom fell silent. My son sighed, as if carrying a weight, and looked away once more. I saw in him the boy who once asked me to hold him, now transformed into a man unable to hold my gaze. His father's absence was the ghost that always haunted me, and now I judged me through it. My daughter-in-law tried to smile, but the smile cracked at the corners of her mouth. Perhaps because she realized my resistance wasn't stubbornness, it was accumulated strength. I didn't need an audience, I didn't need lawyers. My life was my testimony. That invisible tribunal continued for hours, with veiled questions and clipped answers. But something changed. I stopped feeling like a defendant and started feeling like a witness. A witness to my own story, which no one could erase. When I got up from the table, I held my head high as if absolved. Not because they had acquitted me, but because I had declared myself free. I refused to accept the sentence they were trying to impose on me. And that, I realized, was the beginning of my true victory. That day, I understood that the invisible court existed not only outside of me, but also within. And for the first time, I silenced the internal judge that had been condemning me for years. Because, deep down, I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. That afternoon, I decided to open the worn nightstand drawer I rarely touched. Among the yellowed papers and old bills, I found a folded envelope with my fragile handwriting on the back. It was a forgotten note, written by my husband before he left for good. My heart raced at the sight of those words, which time had almost erased. I sat on the bed, my hands trembling, and read slowly. He apologized for not being there, for leaving the burden of raising our son alone on my shoulders. He said he loved me, but that he was too weak to face life. He asked only one thing: take care of him for me. And at the end, a hurried scribble: one day he will understand. Tears fell uncontrollably, not from longing, but from a mixture of anger and relief. I'd carried the guilt of his absence for years, endured my son's accusatory gaze, never revealing the truth. And here was the proof that I wasn't to blame. He was the one who had chosen to leave. Anger stabbed through me like a knife. How many nights had I spent believing I had failed? How many times had I cowered in the face of my son's silent accusations? The note showed me that I struggled alone because I was left behind, not because I didn't want to. The abandonment wasn't my fault. But at the same time, a strange comfort emerged. Deep down, he knew my strength. He recognized that I would carry alone what he couldn't. It was little, almost nothing compared to a life of silence, but it was still a glimmer of recognition. I held that paper for hours, as if it were a key. Maybe it was. The key to freeing my son from the lie he'd believed his entire life. I could show him, And maybe for the first time, he'd see who I really was, not the guilty one, but the woman who saved what was left of the family. I kept the note carefully. It wasn't just a memory, it was a weapon against injustice. But it was also a bomb, allowing me to see my life in a different light. I hadn't failed. I had resisted. That night, I dreamed of my young husband, smiling as if nothing had happened. I woke up startled, but not afraid. I woke up determined. The past might have hurt me, but now it gave me ammunition to face the present. When dawn broke, I looked out the window and felt the weight on my shoulders lift. I was no longer trapped in the silence of guilt. The forgotten note had given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the certainty that I wasn't guilty. And in that yellowed piece of paper, I saw the birth of not only the memory of an absent man, but also the liberation of a woman who no longer accepted carrying burdens that were not hers. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. I went straight to the kitchen and made myself a strong coffee, stronger than usual. As the water boiled, I felt that this simple ritual carried symbolic weight. I needed courage, and that day it would come in the bitter taste that trickled down the cup. I sat at the table with the steaming cup in my hands. My son came in soon after, still drowsy, followed by his daughter-in-law with her hurried steps and suspicious look. I placed the folded note on the table next to the coffee. The silence that fell was heavier than any words. "Read it," he said firmly, without looking up from his drink. My son took the paper with hesitant hands, and as he read, I saw his expression change. First disbelief, then confusion, and finally a shadow of regret. His daughter-in-law, realizing the gravity of it, tried to take the note from his hands, but he stopped her. The coffee slowly cooled, but I remained motionless. I watched every reaction, like someone watching a trial they've waited their entire life for. There was no denying it. My father's words were there, clear, freeing me from guilt and shedding light on the truth that had been buried for years. "My son," his voice breaking, asked, "why didn't you ever show me this?" I took a deep breath before answering. "Because I wanted you to see me for what I did, not for what he didn't do." But now I realized that silence only fueled the lie. He lowered his head, unable to look me in the eye. My daughter-in-law, irritated, let out a dry laugh, saying that it didn't change anything, that the past was the past. But even her voice had a slight tremor. She knew the cards were being shuffled, and that her influence no longer held the same weight. The coffee, cold and bitter, seemed to seal the change. I stood up slowly, holding the now empty cup. "Coffee may taste bad, but it's what wakes us up," I declared. "And the truth is like that coffee, bitter, but necessary to open our eyes." My son didn't answer, but his expression spoke volumes. The room felt smaller, filled with a tension that couldn't be contained within the walls. I, however, felt lighter. That note wasn't just paper, it was the missing bridge to a new phase, even if there was still resistance. I left them there, alone with their thoughts. I went upstairs to my room and looked in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, I saw a woman free from the shadow of guilt. The past still hurt, but now it hurt in a different way, like a scar, not an open wound. And as the morning wore on, I realized that bitter coffee had given me what I needed. Courage. Because sweetness doesn't always sustain. Sometimes, it's in bitterness that we find the strength to carry on. In the living room, on the bookshelf, the old family portrait still rested. It was a black and white photo, taken on one of those rare days when we seemed whole. My husband, my son, and I, all smiling as if nothing could separate us. But that morning, when I reached out to wipe the dusty glass, I noticed the crack that cut the portrait in half. The crack ran through my husband's face, separating him from me and the boy. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just an accident. It was a stark symbol of what was already written into our history. The broken glass reflected exactly what we'd lived through, a love that shattered, a home that was never whole again. I ran my fingers along the crack and felt the roughness of a cut. My heart sank, but I didn't cry. There were no more tears to waste on what I couldn't change. The cracked portrait seemed to be telling me that the past can't be fixed with tape or glue. It needs to be faced for what it is, a wounded memory, but a memory nonetheless. It was then that my daughter-in-law entered the room and, upon noticing the cracked glass, commented sarcastically, "It suits you." The phrase pierced me like a knife. For a moment I wanted to scream, to smash the portrait to the floor. But I restrained myself. I simply straightened the frame and replied, "It's true. It suits you. Because even cracked, I'm still in one piece." My son appeared soon after, staring at the photo in silence. I saw his eyes well up, but he quickly looked away, as if unwilling to admit the pain. Perhaps the crack had also reached his heart, reminding him of his father's absence and the hurt he'd always carried toward me. The atmosphere grew heavy. The crack, once only in the glass, was now in the air. Every misspoken word, every misinterpreted silence, everything was there, reflected in that crack. But instead of shrinking, I felt a strange strength emerge, as if that crack were also a call to show that there was still beauty in what survived. I decided not to replace the glass or hide the crack. I put the portrait back on the shelf, clearly visible. If anyone wanted to look, they could see the scars too. Because I was no longer a woman ashamed of her scars. I was made of them. At night, alone in the living room, I turned on the lamp and stared at the broken portrait. The dim light made the crack shine like lightning piercing through time. I thought about everything I'd lost, but also everything I'd gained. And I realized that, even cracked, my story still had value. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and whispered, "I won't fade." Maybe no one heard, but I heard.
And that was enough.
The cracked portrait wasn't a sign of defeat, but of survival. That night, I fell asleep with a new certainty. Not every broken glass needs to be replaced. Some should remain that way, as a reminder that it is possible to resist and still stand. Rummaging through an old sewing box, I found something that seemed out of place. Among the colorful threads and rusty needles lay a small golden key engraved with the company's crest. My eyes widened in surprise. It was the key to the safe that held important family documents, something my husband always said was well protected. I held the key tightly, as if it had waited years for me to discover it. I felt the weight of a secret hidden deep within a wound. There might be the answer to so many humiliations, to so many doubts that lingered over me. My heart pounded, as if each beat pushed a memory forward. That night, when the house was asleep, I grabbed the key and went to the old office. The safe, hidden behind the bookcase, seemed to stare at me like a guardian of the past. My hands trembled, but I inserted the key. The metallic click echoed through the room, shattering decades of silence. Upon opening, I found stacks of documents, contracts, share records, meeting minutes. Each sheet was concrete proof of what I'd always known but never declared. I was the airline's largest shareholder. I wasn't just the invisible matriarch who supported the household. I was the solid foundation of the empire. My eyes welled up. For years, I'd accepted being treated like dead weight, like someone on the margins. And there was the truth screaming from letterhead. The power had always been mine, but I, out of love for my son and grandchildren, had remained silent. Among the pages, I also found a decades-old letter from the family lawyer, assuring me that no transfer could be made without my signature. And yet, my son and daughter-in-law tried to deceive me, trying to forcibly take what never belonged to them. I calmly closed the safe, but the turmoil inside me grew. The key, which had previously seemed like a forgotten object, now became my shield. It was no longer a matter of paperwork, but of dignity. I finally had the missing proof in my hands. I sat at my desk, took a deep breath, and considered my next steps. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. Not just for myself, but for my grandchildren, who deserve to inherit more than money. They deserve to inherit the truth. I threaded the key through a thin chain and placed it around my neck, like an amulet. I felt the cool metal against my skin, reminding me that I was no longer unarmed. In that moment, I understood that the safe didn't just hold documents. It held my voice, silenced for years. And now that I had the key, No one could lock away my story anymore. I sat at the table with a serenity that belied the storm raging within me. Across from me, my son and his wife looked at each other with that air of practiced superiority, as if I were a decorative piece, already outmoded by time. But that day, I wasn't just the elderly mother enduring silence and humiliation. I was the guardian of the truth, and the time had finally come to expose the cards I'd hidden for so long. I placed an antique leather briefcase on the white tablecloth, an heirloom from my father, a symbol of authority and memory. The sharp thud as it landed echoed through the room like silent thunder. They laughed, perhaps thinking it was just another old woman's whim. But as soon as I opened it, the laughter died down. Documents, signed and stamped, with my name prominently displayed as the airline's majority shareholder, slid across the table like sharp knives. My daughter-in-law was the first to react, her eyes widening in indignation. "This is a farce," she said, trying to grab the papers, but I firmly pulled them back. I looked her in the eye with that look only a mother hardened by life can muster, and declared, "What you've been trying to build at my expense is a farce. Here's the truth you refuse to see." My son, pale, let his hand tremble. For the first time, I saw in him not arrogance, but the boy who once ran into my arms crying after falling off his bike. That same boy now stood before me, unable to sustain his own lie. He never expected that his mother, the same one who silently swallowed his rudeness, would be the cornerstone of the fortune he so flaunted. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" Her voice was broken, as if each word were a confession. I sighed deeply and replied, "Because I believed that love and gratitude were stronger than contracts. But I learned, too late, that silence can be mistaken for weakness. And I'm not weak." The daughter-in-law slammed her hand on the table, uncontrollably. "You can't destroy a family like that," she exclaimed, feigning concern for the union she herself had poisoned. I looked at my grandchildren, playing innocently in the next room, and replied with the calm of someone carrying centuries on their shoulders. "A family isn't destroyed by the truth. It was already being destroyed by lies." A heavy silence fell. It was the kind of silence that signals the end of an empire built on sand. They shrank back in their chairs, and for the first time in years, I straightened my shoulders. She was no longer the mother begging for a place. She was the woman who supported every brick of that house, every penny of that company, every sleepless night caring for a fatherless child. The confrontation wasn't about shouting, but about irrefutable truths. And truths, my son, weigh like stones. I saw their world crumble before the simple force of a stamp and the courage I held in my chest. For the first time, my voice didn't tremble. When I got up from the table, I left the papers in front of them. "From today on, I am no longer a spectator. You choose whether you want to walk with me or against me. But know this, I will not return to silence." And I turned my back, feeling the weight of years of humiliation dissipate like smoke. Deep down there was pain. There was hurt. But above all, there was liberation. The inevitable confrontation wasn't just against them. It was against myself, against the woman I'd accepted as invisible for so long. And that afternoon, I found myself reborn. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up different. The sun streamed through the window as if to remind me that the dark night was over. Still, inside me, my heart pounded, as if trying to escape my chest. The silence in the house seemed denser, heavy with the words that lingered in the air after I'd revealed everything. It wasn't just a new day. It was a new beginning, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, it just happens. My son entered the kitchen without his usual arrogance. His face was drawn, his eyes red, as if he'd been up all night. He sat at the table, stared at the cup of coffee I'd poured, and said nothing for a few seconds. I remained quiet too, having learned that sometimes silence weighs more heavily than any lecture. Until finally he murmured, "Mom, I didn't know how much I hurt you." I swallowed hard. I wanted to scream, to spill decades of hurt, but I took a deep breath. "You knew," I replied, looking straight ahead. "Maybe you didn't want to admit it, but every look, every gesture of yours carried contempt. I endured it in silence out of love for my grandchildren, but that doesn't diminish what I experienced. He lowered his head, and in that gesture I saw not a grown man, but a lost boy searching for forgiveness. The daughter-in-law, however, didn't react the same way. She walked in soon after, her eyes flashing with anger. "This is a show," she said, pointing at me. "You want to turn my husband against me. You want to become a heroine. But I won't allow you to destroy what we've built together." I gave a slight smile, not mockingly, but as if no longer willing to be hurt. What you built together was a wall of lies. And walls, my daughter, sooner or later crack. The truth weighed heavily. Not just for them, but for me as well. Carrying it in silence all these years had crushed me inside. Revealing it now was liberating, but also painful, because it exposed the wounds we all pretended didn't exist. It was like opening a window after years in the dark. The light illuminates, but also reveals the accumulated dust. My son stood up and took my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it disarmed me inside. "I don't know if I can make amends, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "But I want to try." I squeezed his hand tightly, and my eyes filled with tears. Making amends isn't about erasing my son. It's about learning to carry the weight of truth and, who knows, transforming it into a bridge. My daughter-in-law slammed the door, unable to accept the new reality. And I understood that some paths separate because no truth can unite them. I looked at my fragile son and saw a spark of hope. It wasn't complete forgiveness yet, but it was the first step toward him seeing the mother who had always been there for him. In that moment, I realized the truth hurts. It tears away masks, it shatters illusions, but it also opens space for something new. I no longer needed to fight for recognition. The one who needed recognition was him, and, for the first time, I realized I was willing to do so. I felt the weight of truth settle on my shoulders, but this time it didn't crush me. On the contrary, it lifted me up. It was a weight that reminded me that, despite everything, I survived. That my story didn't end in rejection, but in the courage to face the ghosts and transform them into light. And there, between a cup of cold coffee and a plea for a fresh start, I understood that the truth, even painful ones, was the only path to liberation. Not just for me, but for our entire family. I looked around the room, and everything seemed different. It wasn't the furniture, nor the portraits on the wall, but the atmosphere. The weight of the masks had fallen, and only the raw air of truth remained. For the first time in many years, I felt I could breathe without the lump of humiliation in my throat. The confrontation had already happened, the wounds were exposed, and now all that remained was to choose what to do with the scars. My son approached slowly, his expression one of someone who finally saw beyond his own pain. He was no longer the arrogant man who blamed me for absences that weren't mine. I saw in him a rare vulnerability, a heart trying to relearn how to love without the crutches of pride. "Mom, I don't want to lose you," he said, almost in a whisper. And those words, simple and belated, were worth more than any fortune. The daughter-in-law, for her part, remained distant. Her eyes still held the venom of resistance. I harbored no hatred, but I knew that some people prefer lies because the truth demands changes they don't want to face. She could continue her journey on another path. My mission wasn't to bring her back, but to show my son that he still had a mother who, despite everything, hadn't given up on him. The grandchildren, oblivious to the arguments, ran up to me laughing, hugging my legs innocently. There, I felt the true meaning of inheritance. It wasn't the company's shares, the houses, or the assets that were now registered in my name. What I had to leave couldn't fit in a safe. It was love, it was an example, it was the certainty that resistance, even in silence, is also a way to win. I held them in my arms, one in each, and thought about how many more stories I could tell. Stories of struggle, of pain, but also of overcoming. They needed to know that the grandmother many tried to silence was, in fact, a woman who refused to be erased. This was my invisible legacy, the strength to not give up on oneself, even when everyone seemed to conspire against it. My son watched me silently, and I noticed discreet tears welling in his eyes. Perhaps, in that moment, he understood everything I'd endured. There was no longer any need for long speeches. His gaze told me the bridge was beginning to be rebuilt. And, though fragile, it was a bridge built on truth, not convenience. The house no longer seemed so empty. The echo of the walls, which I'd previously remembered as abandoned, now rang like a testament to a new phase. It wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense, but it was a true ending. And the truth, even harsh, is always more worthy than any pretense of happiness. I sat in the living room armchair with my grandchildren around me and closed my eyes for a moment. I relived every tear I swallowed, every slight I endured, every silence I imposed. And I realized that none of it was in vain. It all led me here, to this moment where I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The invisible legacy I leave is not made of numbers, but of courage. It is the legacy of a woman who, even when rejected, humiliated, and unjustly accused, chose to stand tall. Because being a mother is more than giving life. It is teaching, until the last breath, that dignity is not lost. It only grows stronger when tested by fire. And so, with my heart scarred but intact, I understood that my story didn't end in contempt. It ended in overcoming. And I left, for those who came after me, the lesson that there is no greater fortune than the truth carried in one's heart. That, indeed, is the inheritance no one can steal. Have you ever considered how many times you've treated someone in your own family as a burden, when in reality, that person was the foundation that held everything together? How many mothers, grandmothers, fathers, and grandfathers live in silence today, enduring humiliation, while carrying within themselves the true strength that keeps the house standing. This story is not just about a cash inheritance, but about the invisible inheritance, the dignity, courage, and truth that no safe can store. So, I ask you, if you were in that mother's place, would you have the courage to remain silent, or the courage to stand up? And if you were the son, would you have the humility to acknowledge the truth before it was too late? Because in the end, it's not the possessions that remain. What truly endures is what we build within the hearts of those we love, and that, my friend, neither time, nor lies, nor ingratitude can steal.